Benvenuti all'Istituto Italiano di Cultura. Welcome everybody. I'm Giorgio Van Straten. I'm the director of the Institute. And I would like to say just a few words because we have the panelists and we want to listen to them. I have to say that I'm very happy to host this exhibition that I think it's the most visited exhibition at the Institute since I arrived here, together with the exhibition of Bronzino. And so I had to really thank American Academy in Rome that accepted to take here in our institute this exhibition that I think it's marvelous for the quality of the photos, for the quality of the city that the photo show. And so really I have to thank all the friends from American Academy. First of all, the curator of the exhibition, Lindsay Harris, and but my friend and president of American Academy in Rome, Mark Harris, and I asked him to, Mark Robbins, and I asked him to come here to the floor. Please, Mark.
Thank you very much. Can you hear? Can you hear it without? Doesn't matter. It is. Oh, they are? Okay, good. It's great to see you all. I like SRO from Matera. Lindsay, you have a great eye. This is really Lindsay's idea, Lindsay's show. And we'll say a little bit more about Lindsay and the exhibition in a minute. But I want to thank our collaborators here at the Italian Cultural Institute. Giorgio Van Straten, who just had a book signing for his own book with Andre Asselman, who was another resident at the Academy, which was delightful. So Italian culture is everywhere. And thank you so much for partnering with us. This is the second exhibition that the American Academy has done here, and it's part of a larger effort to, in some ways, spread the word, but to show the work of artists and scholars in Rome, or the work that's produced in Rome, across the country. I want to recognize our partners like the Italian Cultural Institute, but also the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation. I just saw, where's Elizabeth Smith? I just saw her walk in. And Elizabeth is the head of the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation, who once again this year is supporting this speaker series. So this is the conversation series. It's one of 8 we'll do in the United States this year, but we also do them across the country. Which is a great way of talking about the presence of the arts and humanities in the United States. So for Elizabeth, wherever you are, I think you're probably waiting SRO. Let's give a round of applause. Oh, there you are. We do better finding each other in Rome. This is good. I'm not, is this? Yes. Speaking of Rome, it's great to see so many fellows in the house. If you were a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, Bunny, I see you. Could you just raise your hand? So it's great to see you back here. Patty, wonderful. And so please remember those hands, and at the end of the program, ask them what their experience was like at the American Academy. So both for residents and fellows, it's a unique place that supports just time to think, time to do work without the pressure of tenure or committee meetings or preparing food for yourself. And so to join a community in which everyone is going through the same thrill and anxiety of production in the study or the studio is really a kind of remarkable thing to experience. And I'm delighted to be at the Academy as president. So the exhibition that you've just seen represents just one of the many programs that we do in Rome and the United States. The exhibition Matera opened in Rome, and then it went to the city of Matera, which is in Basilicata, traditionally one of the poorest areas, provinces in Italy. And it's an exhibition that spans from 1948, photographs from 1948 to the current period. And it includes an array of photographers. Emmet Gowin, I'm delighted to have with us here. And we see some of the work of magnum photographers like Esther Bublé, all the way to Carrie Mae Weems and the architect Yasmin Vobis. It's a wonderful collection of images that represent the mythology that surrounds the city and also the realities of what life is like and the disparity between North and South. As I mentioned, this was a project of Lindsay Harris's, and Lindsay worked on this for years. Lindsay comes to us from her most recent post as the Mellon Professor at the American Academy in Rome, where she served for 4 years. And before that, she was a fellow of the Academy and also was at the National Gallery. Her background is in the study of 19th and 20th century photography. So it was a perfect match for us to have Lindsay at the Academy, both as a scholar and also someone who could help us to interpret the 55,000 some odd pieces that we have in our phototeca, which has been a great joy for us to watch. And so without further ado, I just want to thank all of our panelists, thank Lindsay again for her wonderful work, and I'm going to hand the baton over to Lindsay and have her introduce the panelists tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for that very kind introduction. And thanks also to Mark for the opportunity for having put this show together. This was a show that I kind of came on board with the Academy, and I already had it in mind. The kernel was sparked in 2007 when I first encountered the photographs of one of the perhaps less assuming photographers in the show, Margery Collins. She was a photographer who, like Esther Bublé, also worked for Roy Stryker during the Farm Security Administration and Office of War Information. And I came across a photograph of hers, of Matera, one that's not actually in the show, but another one, in an article. And I thought it was fascinating. I thought, what was this American woman doing in Matera in 1950? This to me seemed very intrepid on her part. And I wanted to know more about her. I wanted to know more about this place. And the results are what you see here in the galleries this evening. I'm also extremely grateful to Giorgio van Straten for the opportunity to have brought the show here. I was arriving on the train today from Washington, D.C., and I could see on the skyline the city where I went to graduate school at the Institute of Fine Arts. And I was thinking about the many roads that have taken me back and forth across the Atlantic between New York and Italy so many times that have brought me and all of you here tonight to discuss the photographs that are brought together in this exhibition. When we go to exhibitions, we go to readings, we experience culture in an hour together. Oftentimes we don't understand or really think about the months, years, decades of not only work and thinking, but also wonderful collaborations and connections and conversations that have brought all of that to fruition. And tonight is yet another instance of this particular project, what that has meant to me in terms of bringing such wonderful people together. And I want to thank, if I may, just a few of them specifically, although there are so many I would never be able to do that. I would like specifically to thank Aurelia Sole and Paolo Verri, who are the president and director, respectively, of the Fondazione Matera Basilicata 2019, which is the entity overseeing Matera's accolade as European Capital of Culture in 2019. Now, this is an exhibition that, as Mark was suggesting, charts the evolution of this fascinating town in what we might call the arch of the boot of Italy, from its really role as a symbol or epitome of the backwardness of southern Italy, especially on the heels of Carlo Levi's celebrated memoir, Christ Stopped at Eboli of 1945. Matera emerged on an international scene because that book was translated into so many languages immediately by 1946, 47. Matera became an international symbol of poverty and of cave dwellings. Its infamous sassi became distinctly unmodern in that moment, in the cultural imagination. Now, to be sure, people were sick and overcrowded and malaria was an issue and cholera was an issue, and it was not by any means am I trying to romanticize the way of life. But the trajectory of that town from that moment to today, I would think that many of you have been there, and if you haven't been there, I strongly encourage you to go. To this day, it remains a little bit hard to get there, which is one of its most endearing qualities. And I think it will always be a little hard to get there because of where it is. As Paolo Verri, the director, said one day, from his house in Matera, he looks out the window and I think of Utah, he said. And we all thought, what does he mean by that? But it's precisely the kind of dry, rugged, primal, authentic landscape, all adjectives we'll discuss this evening, that you see, for example, in Emmet Gowin's photograph or that of Luigi Ghirri or so many of the other photographers here this evening. I'm also particularly thankful and delighted to welcome this evening our three panelists. The first of whom who will speak this evening is the celebrated photographer Emmet Gowin. I discovered in the course of researching this exhibition, to my really great surprise, because Emmet is somebody, and I mentioned this when I had the occasion to meet him for the first time in Rome about a year ago, a photographer who I've always admired and came to know his work more intimately at the National Gallery. And then I stumbled across this jewel-like faceted landscape that you'll see here in the exhibition that he took in Matera in 1980. And this to me was a kind of like, you know, wind slaps you across the face. What? How did that come to pass? So this is the kind of allure that Matera has that can draw so many photographers from so many different walks of life, not to mention filmmakers, writers, archaeologists, anthropologists. This is just one piece of a very rich history. Of course, it was not a total surprise because of Emmet Gowin's unique eye for recognizing and representing the kind of beauty and awe that we see in that particular photograph, not only in Matera, but in so many details and locations remote and more common in the world. And I'm so grateful that he and his wife Edith have come tonight. I'll just tell you that when we were in Rome, after some 45 minutes of listening to his account of Matera as part of his larger sweep of his art as a photographer, we were all not only speechless, but many of us had tears dripping down our faces because of the heartfelt genuineness with which he had conveyed the spirit behind his work. And I'm sure you'll get a glimpse of that this evening. This project has also brought together a wonderful array of scholars of different fields, including Antonella Pelizzari, who's seated there in the middle, an associate professor of art history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center at CUNY here in New York, although originally from Italy, who specializes in the history of photography writ large, but it is her particular insight into the history of photography in Italy that I have always admired so greatly and for which I am so looking forward to hearing her take on Matera tonight. Her work, in addition to writing about the parallel developments of photography and Italy as a nation, also has highlighted some of the most important artists working with photography in Italy who have challenged really what we mean by art that uses photography, including, for example, Mario Cresci, two of whose works are in the exhibition tonight, who falls into that category of an artist using photography to express a larger idea about art, about place, and these are some of the key themes that we will be discussing this evening. We also have with us Professor Emma Blake on the far side, who is a professor of anthropology and archaeology at the University of Arizona and also a fellow of the Academy in 2013. And I was a fellow the year after Emma, and I will admit that we have mutual friends, Kim Bowes, the former director of the Academy, who always spoke about the pioneering insights that Emma brought to the fields of archaeology and anthropology precisely because she integrates these different ideas and different disciplines and therefore different methodologies and concepts of place and of people. And so I reached out to her to ask her to contribute to the catalog about Matera, and her essay challenges what we think of when we think of the word authenticity with relationship to this place. Why do we think of it as this continuum of the past? To what degree does our experience of Matera actually reflect anything of its original, quote unquote, original formation, or what era of the past are we foregrounding rather than any other? So I am really delighted to be able to bring these three speakers together this evening. The format of our evening will unfold as follows. I'm going to welcome now Emmett Gowin to the podium, who's going to speak briefly about his work here, and then he'll come and join us seated in the front, at which point I'm going to open a conversation among the three panelists here centered on issues of photography in place, but then we'll see how the conversation unfolds. And time permitting, we will invite questions from you because we're also delighted that you're here to be part of the conversation. So thank you very much. And with that, I would like to welcome Emmet Gowin.
I wanted to give you a context in about 20 pictures that is particularly personal. I was not a child who was going to go to Italy because I thought Italy was the best place in the world. I fell in love with art history, but that still wouldn't have done it. It was only when a classmate from Virginia wrote me and said, if you ever think of coming to Italy, I have married into an Italian family and we have a place here for you. And I was wonderfully awestruck by the letter. And I said, oh, I would love to learn about Italy. And so Italy from 1973 on became a place that we would go almost every summer, at least for 2 or 3 weeks. And it was, in the beginning was Florence, and then north of Florence in Mugello, Scarperia. And this amazing picture, when I think about the problems of photography and the confusion that photography can spread, and every time I see this picture, I'm stunned to think about it myself. The wall of this building is at least 30 yards long. And yet in the image, it's compressed to something, the width. It looks like this. It's the distortion of form that a viewpoint gives us. And I was using a lens that really wasn't proper for the camera that I was using it on. It was making a circle. It was showing the entire image. That lenses are circular pieces of glass, and if you see the entire circle, that the image was normally selected from. But this was the whole thing. And that summer was a turning point for me, and that trip to Italy was followed by another and another. And by 1975, when I had a Guggenheim Fellowship, I'd wanted to work in Peru, trying to do with families in Peru what I had done with a family in Virginia. And I failed miserably. And any young artist, but artist at any time in your life, that feeling of failing is a powerful, instructive, wonderful thing. I got back in Italy and somehow the failure of Peru just went away. And one day we had driven to the wall of Siena. And in fact, mysteriously, I think we were due back for another event of much greater significance and importance. But seeing this little garden from the road around the base of the wall of Siena, once I'd seen the field, I realized if I walked away from this, I would regret it for the rest of my life. Now, this was just a key turning point. For 15 years, I've been photographing one family in Virginia. Portraits, intimate pictures, things that you weren't really supposed to see or talk about or show people. When I think about place and think about that distortion of form and the defamiliarizing of things that comes with photography, just look what a shock. This is a picture that the camera probably only moved about this far from the original position. 12 feet, perhaps. It's the same tree. It's the same field, but doesn't look anything alike. The picture's a totally new structure, a totally new mosaic. And after I'd made the first picture in 75, I thought, well, I'll go back and look at the field because it's so beautiful, but I'll never make another picture there. But going back, I realized we're not in charge of what is really important. What is important comes after us, and it changes us. In 1980, a semester in Florence. And while I was on leave, the same friend found a villa for us to live in. But we could only afford to do it if we took on 5 Italian students. Well, we shared the cooking facilities and we shared everything. A crazy time. And in that time, it's the Italian landscape or the agricultural landscape, something that has been crafted over centuries, which is handmade in essence. Things, adaptations of the landscape for structural reasons that are known best only to the farmer. So I was in love with Italy. And it was, I'm gonna go back one more because just sort of say something about those students. It turned out of those 5 students, 4 of them were from Matera. And they kept talking to me about it. And they said, oh, we like what you're doing. You have to come to our city because our city is so special. Well, it was so special. And I'm showing you the version that's in the show here. And you have to look closely. And I don't know if you can see it in a projection like this. But in this version, all of the television antennas are there. Now, that's not a very big point. Here's the big point. One day, 2 of these students came in from work, and they said, oh, we have this fantastic book on our city, Augusto Vigiano's book on Matera. And we looked at this thing. We were both in tears and in shock. And my response to them was, what a fantastic, beautiful city. This cannot be photographed any better than this. There's no reason for me to go there. And they said, oh, no, you have to come home with us for Christmas. Well, this 3 double-page spreads from Vigiano's book. The pictures, I don't know why these pictures aren't famous. I don't think they are. One of the things that touched me so much in Matera was seeing that at the outskirts of the city was being quarried. It was being cut out of its own stone. The stone into which the caves had been carved, in which people had lived for thousands of years. At the outskirts of the city, the mountains, the ground itself was being sawn up with electric saws. And these 2 pictures show that, the debris pile of cinder block-like material. It's tufa, it's volcanic stone. It can be cut with a saw or a chisel or a hoe, and the quarry itself. 2 buildings. Now again, the Matera. And this is the original form. The picture would have been about 8 by 10 inches, a small thing. And for some reason that you don't need to be able to explain these things, but I had removed the sky. I'd taken the sky completely away. And in the process, aged the city, took away its antennas, and replaced it with a rather albumin-like 19th century sky. Now, place is a tricky thing. If you can notice the upper right-hand corner of this picture is the lower, I have to turn myself, lower left-hand corner of that picture. These 2 pictures look so unalike, so the 2 perspectives seem impossible. And yet the 2 pictures were taken without moving the camera, except to tilt it down and to reorganize a slightly closer space. And that's part of the trick of place. I've gone back to this again because I want you to see if you can recognize the building on your right. After those 2 distant views of the city, I became completely enchanted and wanted to just spend every minute I could there. So I went there in 80, 81, 82, 83, and back for a wedding in 85. And then that was it. Somehow it had run its course. But the beauty, did you know J.B. Jackson's book, The Necessity for Ruins? There's a lesson in it that I'm going to oversimplify at peril to the good thinking. But I love this idea that it is through experience, our own personal experience of ruins, that we gain a full perspective of the past, a knowledge of something that is our own lives, but indirectly. And right in these very same time frames, an invitation to see the Petra in Jordan, which was somehow had pulled me into a sense of the antique world, something that I never thought I would want to study or think about. In fact, getting home with this picture, I realized there was an engraving like this in the back of my father's Bible, something I would never have thought about. This is in Turkey, first century Christian ruin. And it's the same material as Matera. It's volcanic ash that's been compressed over 50 to 100,000 years, into which these people cut their habitation. Again, Matera, and a distance of maybe 12 yards and a few feet of elevation, the same spot, and how different it looks. The question of place, the question of the photography's myopic vision. You, out of the whole 360-degree spherical world, there is one place from which it's being observed. A last example, a picture from 1982, and I can remember my response, oh, it's somehow incomplete. And I didn't print it for 15 years. And when I was working with Joel Smith, the curator at the Morgan Library a few years ago, we had put these two views of Matera into a loose leaf notebook so that when you turned the pages, there they were, congruent to each other. And after multiple viewings of the two pictures together, we said, oh, well, that's where they belong. They're in fact probably a quarter of a mile distance from each other. They don't really exist in that space, but there is a psychological unity between them. I want to end by saying something really simple. My friend, the African-American artist Lonnie Holly, loves to say, us artists, we all want the same thing. Real, authentic, real beauty. Thank you.
I am very pleased that right off the bat we have challenged what even we mean by place, to the degree to which it is a construction or a selected vision of the world around us. I wanted to turn the conversation to Antonella, if I may. Now, you're a scholar who has thought a lot about the representation of Italy, well, lots of places through photography, but Italy specifically. And I wonder if you might reflect for a moment with us about how the kinds of representations of Matera about which we've just heard and that we see in this exhibition relate to or don't to other cities or places within Italy that have come to be so iconic through photographs that we almost go to the places now looking for the reality we come to know through the photographs.
Right. Does it work? Yes. Yes, as I'm looking at the exhibition, which congratulations, we know also how difficult sometimes it is to borrow works and send them far away. So congratulations for all that and the choice of images in the show. Well, and looking at the beautifully printed book here, I've been asking myself this question: how do we situate the iconography of Matera in photography vis-a-vis our image of Italy? Now, when you look at photographs of Italy, when you think of Italy, the big enemy, right, the real enemy is the cliché, the stereotype. Italy has, obviously, I don't need to say it, this very long tradition of representation of painters and draftsmen who go there, and photography continues that tradition. Now, Matera presents an interesting situation, and you wrote in the catalog how Matera can be a lab for experimentation, because as I was looking at some of these images, I'm thinking Ghirri, for example, who is the master of linear perspective as we think of it in Renaissance. If you look at his views of Capri and certainly of Emilia, the region where he came from, well, things seem to somewhat fall apart. Matera defies ideas and perspectives and images that we have, that we can use so easily to frame the Italian landscape, the church, the picturesque view. I've been in Matera once and it blew my mind. Sublime is definitely a word for Matera. And I think it's very interesting to think of some of these images, maybe some more than others, how the photographers have really tried to find a new language, right? And Emmett, I wrote about your work and never published, and I'm actually quite moved to be here and rethinking about these images. As I was thinking about your work, I think what the Italian landscape, but perhaps Matera in particular, has done that is so powerful, I think, is sort of, it's been a resolution of a dilemma that I see in your work between this incredibly rooted sense of place, Virginia, the intimate images you were talking about, and the sense of otherness, of going away from home, leaving home, and the way you get close to the stones, the way you express this very earthly quality. It's so interesting to bring that back to your work that speaks of home as Virginia. It sort of resolves that. Also very being very close to Mario Cresci, whose work you see in the show here. It is another really interesting example of a photographer who goes to Matera, and he also has a background as a graphic designer, and doesn't look for the cliche, starts setting up workshops, is really intrigued with the objects of work and with the meaning of these objects for the local people. So it's very interesting, and you see this angel with broken wings here, which is very much part of his conversation with the locals. He lives in Matera, which obviously is very much part of his wanting to be immersed in the craft and the anthropology. I'm sure we'll hear more about of the place. And once again, I think it's very interesting how that vision defies the idea of the cliche, and in a way thinks of place as a collection of objects. Place is not only, right, landscape as we understand it, but is also a portrait, an object of craft, measuring the object, can be abstraction. And I think Matera has tested the photographic lens in a very interesting way. Some images in the show speak more of narrative, right? A la Cartier-Bresson, there is Cartier-Bresson, and obviously Seymour, Chim, and that some of those images bring me to think of the masterpiece by Pierpaolo Pasolini, the Gospel according Matthew, because I think for some photographers this quite abstract and definitely archaic landscape has represented this kind of stage, and we understand, if you haven't seen it, Rent, Pasolini's film, shot in Matera, most of it, because Matera really becomes this stage, almost like a nativity scene, right? It feels almost unreal and fake and built for the people to perform. That I think is very interesting. One other aspect I've been thinking a lot about as I was leafing through your book is how Matera has called upon photographers and artists and writers to collaborate. There's something very interesting there when we think of certainly Simon and Levi, you and the photographers who brought there, certainly Cresci working with anthropologists, Patellani works with Lattuada as he's filming there. So there's something interesting about that, how the place, perhaps of its overwhelming nature, calls for a collaboration, for a dialogue of some sort. So I would say Matera defies that enemy of the cliché as we think of images of Italy, which I do consider an enemy because oftentimes it has hindered experimentation, right? Because it's a repetition of a certain view. And we like to think of photographic expression as something that is constantly opening our minds and eyes. And sometimes Italy suffers from that because of the canonization of its landscape. Matera presents an interesting challenge with that.
Mm-hmm. So we've heard several times now reference to anthropology as an integral part of what we think of when we think of Matera and how we've come to know about it. Certainly Fosco Maraini, another photographer in this exhibition, originally from Florence, is also perhaps best known as an anthropologist who later goes on to work in East Asia and Japan specifically. But the anthropological angle, I mean, photography is just one of the many ways through which we tonight specifically are thinking about the place that Matera represents, but it is also, in addition to landscape and objects and stones, it is a place of people who have lived there, and this is one of the things that makes it so fascinating to us, how long they've lived there and what that residential quality of this place between habitation and abandonment says about authenticity. And I wonder if, Emma, you could reflect on those ideas based on your work, and for those of you who have the opportunity to read her essay in the catalog, you're in for a real treat. It's a real highlight of that book.
Thank you. Yes, I'm interested. I approach Matera from a different perspective, very much as an archaeologist and somewhat of a skeptic. Whenever archaeologists or anthropologists hear terms like timeless or authentic or I can't even think of anything the opposite of modernity, we sort of bristle and say, what's going on there? So when you scrape away the layers of Matera and actually look at the archaeological record for the site, it has, it isn't so timeless. It actually has a pretty recent, well, I shouldn't say, it's not recent, but it's a pretty fixed beginning to the settlement of the site. The earliest evidence, I should say, does go way back. The earliest evidence is from 100,000 years ago. That's a long time. It's pre-modern, before anatomically modern humans. There are some final Acheulean hand axes found in not a rock, not a carved tomb, but carved cave, but a natural cave that's near Grotta dei Pipistrelli, which is near the site, near the city of Matera. So there is this early evidence, and I think that's been kind of the basis for triggering people saying, oh, it's been occupied for, back into the mists of time. Well, there was this brief occupation, and then it fell out of use for many thousands of years, and then we have a little bit more occupation at another natural cave around 30,000 years ago, and then we don't have anything till the Neolithic period. And as I tell you the story, you don't need to remember all these dates, but what I want you to be gathering is that this is an area that has not experienced continuous habitation or occupation for thousands and thousands of years. Quite the opposite. This is not, the people who found themselves living in Matera in the 1950s before they were moved out of the Sassi, were not there because of inertia. They weren't there because this was the only way they knew to live. In fact, the occupation of Matera has constantly been a choice in many millennia that people have come to, and then they've abandoned it when it hasn't been appropriate to live there, or it hasn't suited them, and then they move back in. So the story, the earliest evidence we have, and we could find earlier, but as far as everybody can tell, the earliest evidence of settlement in those caves, like carving out of caves in the Gravina, in the ravine where the Sassi are located, is around the 8th and 9th centuries CE. AD. So about 1,200, 1,300 years ago is when this site was first occupied. Before that, there was sporadic use in the Roman period, but at the top of the plateau. They did not carve out and live in those the caves before the 8th or 9th century CE. They carved a lot into the natural the tufa, because it's very useful for that, and I'll talk a little bit more about how the human engagement with the landscape is really central to this story. But it's only in the 8th and 9th centuries, for very specific reasons, that Matera comes into being as the town that we now see today. And what happened, as far as we can understand, is that there was a population, I don't want to say explosion, but an increase in population, not just in Matera, but throughout southern Italy. This is after sort of recovering from the severe decline, the collapse that occurred when the Roman Empire collapsed. It took a few centuries, 8th and 9th centuries, people are coming back. They're under Lombard and then Byzantine rule. And so there's more people. And then there's another thing going on, which is that the Saracens are raiding the coast of Italy, and it's very dangerous to live in the coastal cities like Taranto and other ones. And so people are moving inland. So you have a population growth and people moving away from the coast. And those two things seem to have triggered the settlement of Matera. And it's at that point that we can see what we consider to be an urban center there. So we can really date it quite well to this moment. But it's still not a huge site, and we can see this from the church. We have ecclesiastical records through the Middle Ages that don't mention Matera until the 10th century. I think it's 968. It first appears as a diocese. It's listed in the church rolls as a diocese in this part of Italy, and so that means it reached a certain threshold where it could be recognized by the church, and so then after that it's established. So there is a beginning to this city, and its foundation is not in the midst of time. It is for very specific circumstances that were happening over a broader area. And similarly, I sound like the super skeptic, but I think Matera is super fantastic, but I think it's fantastic for reasons that I want, what I want to do is try to give credit to the people of Matera for not just being stuck in the past, but in fact making the choice to live in these caves. So anyway, to continue, so the decision, if you're wondering, well, why did they carve out the caves? Well, that too was not due to just some sort of isolated atavistic connection to this landscape. It was part of a habit that you find throughout the early medieval Mediterranean world of occupying, but you saw them in Turkey from earlier, but they continue to do that. And some of it is tied to Byzantine monasticism, but it's also a secular practice as well, that you find all dotted around the Mediterranean. Sicily has quite a few, North Africa, of these habitations constructed by carving out of any soft rocks. If you have limestone, tufa, whatever it is, people would avail themselves of that. And constructing churches. There's 150 churches or something in Matera that were constructed in this way, troglodytic churches. So anyway, then we get it established in the 8th or 9th centuries, and it continues and it grows, and it's more than just a living space. We think of it as, we focus on the churches and the houses, but actually what I think is perhaps most remarkable about Matera is that they also dug a very elaborate water catchment and management system in these in the ravines to collect water and manage it, because it comes infrequently. Rains come infrequently in southern Italy. You grab what you can, and otherwise you're going to lose it in runoffs that will continue down the ravine. So they had these underground cisterns and channels and things that were used and curated for centuries. They didn't, again, it was not inertia. They modified them, improved them, worked with them to come up with the most efficient use of water collection that they could, which we could really use from now. Living in Arizona, we now are all investing in water harvesting systems because we're freaked out about climate change in the Southwest, and I think we could take a page from the residents of Matera who engaged in this. And we can see this through time. They keep changing them. The city changes for up until the late medieval, early modern periods. They're still modifying these structures in pretty significant ways. And then we fast forward to the mid-20th century, and we see a place that seems to be out of history, out of time, a vestige of the past. But it too, and I'm sure Antonella can speak more to this than I can, is a product of larger events that are happening far beyond Matera, not just its isolation, but it's the part of the uneven distribution of the wealth of the capitalist system in Italy and beyond that lead to Matera and other parts of the South suffering so greatly. So and then we see the forced abandonment of the Sassi, and now a new appreciation from it, of the Sassi and people wanting to return to live there. But in both cases, in both the sort of the 1950s reaction, oh, these people are so primitive, you cannot live in caves with animals, you must leave. And I would say the current idea, the sort of nostalgia for this past that seems pre-modern and timeless, they're both sides of the same coin. One is positive, one is negative, but they're both grounded in this very romanticized, essentializing view of what is actually a pretty dynamic place if you look at the long-term view. And I just want to say there is a little piece of evidence of the dynamism of Matera in a little Easter egg in the photographs. The Cartier-Bresson photo from one of the woman with the donkey and the sheep, she's carrying a turkey, and turkeys weren't introduced into Italy until the 1500s, well, 15th century when Columbus brought them back from the New World. So even in that photo that just seems to capture this timeless tradition of Matera, we have evidence of change built in. So
it's a wonderful reading of that detail. And it's been wonderful to listen to other people's readings of details. For example, this was brought to me by Annalisa Metta, who's a landscape architect, Italian fellow of the American Academy, the first NL-sponsored fellow, looked at the photographs by Dan Weiner. There's one where there's a series of men sitting on a bench with trees, small little trees, in a fairly manicured sidewalk in front of them. And the trees are planted in little holes in the sidewalk, and the trees look more or less like saplings. And in fact, what you see is one of the few pictures that, because it's cropped, you don't necessarily focus on the fact that, for those of you who know Matera, there's a plain, there's a plateau where the later development happens, and the 17th and 18th century flourishes, and then the 20th century fascist era interventions really bolster and ratify that part of the city. And then you'd go down into this two sassi, the two bowls, as it were, where these sassi are carved. And that particular picture by Weiner is taken on the plateau. Very few of the photographs in the exhibition are, and in fact, very few of the photographs of Matera are from the plateau. But what you're seeing is this newly cured landscape, or even in the funeral the funeral procession of the little girl, or the baby, sorry, in the hearse, the white hearse that's on a road in a vertical procession by David Seymour. She noticed the way in which that street has been relatively recently paved. You can see, in fact, it's in the middle of the road. It's still unpaved, because what is essentially happening there is a sewage system. An open channel has been paved over to make a road. So what you're seeing in these photographs, in the very small details, in bricks laid here, or in antennas here or not here, are signs of modernization, signs of this town actually becoming very much with the infrastructure and standards and services of any other modern city. But they blend in such a way that you're drawn to everything that looks more archaic, that looks more authentically of this timeless, in the mists of time, historic place, so that modernization creeps up almost unawares. And I was wondering, actually, from your point of view, Emmett, as an artist working there, when you can't help but go through this modern town before you get to the Sassi. You can't just arrive in the Sassi the way it works. if you can recall that compulsion to turn your lens away from that part of the city and look more towards the Sassy, or maybe that wasn't your experience.
Well,
then.
the year was 1980.
Mm-hmm.
And that December, early December, there was a severe earthquake in southern Italy. And the nearby large city would be the government center for Basilicata, was severely damaged, and a lot of people died. And one of the reasons that the lower, earlier building is completely abandoned is they were simply evicted. They were simply told it was unsafe to be here. And we were a bit risky in going there. Now, I was with those students. Those students lived there. They knew the ropes. They knew what they could get away with. And they were taking me around the most backward routes to get into the town. But once we were in, once we were down in the town, free to roam, certainly, had there not just been an earthquake, this would have been populated. There would have been people running around. There are one or two people in this picture. There's a little church gathering. It happens to be a Sunday, and some people have left church, and there's a car or two. Mm-hmm. But no, I was set up by the fact that the Italian photographer, Augusto Vigiano, had made this fantastic poem about the old city. Mm-hmm. And so I was already primed. I mean, I went to pay my respects to his genius, really, and to the genius of the city itself, as it's full of shape-shifting and form invention and cleverness. I mean, you walk in the streets, and the brilliance of the way in which adaptations have occurred that accommodate more people in the same small space, the tiny stairways, the vistas. When a couple of those pictures that I showed looked like old window views. You don't really know what they were, but that's uninhabited space now, but they become a new window. But you sense that there is the eye of the inhabitant is richly rewarded as they look from the door, they look from the window. They're looking out in this, it is like you say, it's just two circular bowls of habitation. The caves along the wall, that must have been the earliest, and then the major structures that are completely constructed of this tufa block. Mm-hmm. A thing about Turkey that just occurred to me, my mind was racing with too many things at once. The stone in Turkey that I was experiencing there was identical to the ash that was being erupted at Mount St. Helens. And when Queen Noor, who had been a student at Princeton, had called us, I was actually at Mount St. Helens, and she said, "We're having an arts festival in Jordan this summer, can you come?" Of course I can come. But what really was working in my emotional system, and one of this part of the sense of participating in the antiquity of the land itself, is that ash in Mount St. Helens is still 100,000 years, or at least 50,000 years away from becoming tufa. Mm-hmm. It'll be just pyroclastic powder for a long, long time, but enough layers get laid down, enough weight builds up on it, you can saw it up and build. And so all of the upper modern city is made out of cinder block-like material that has been mined or quarried.
This is making me think, I saw in the audience some of Richard Gluckman and his wife Tiffany, who were residents at the Academy a few years ago. And I had the occasion to travel to Matera several times with groups of fellows and residents. And one time there was among the group a geologist, Gary Hildebrand, also a landscape architect, who looked out from the pinnacle of actually another one of these towns that has presently been abandoned called Krakow, I think it's called, which is up on a hill as opposed to down in a valley, and has recently been abandoned because of both a confluence of earthquake and modernization of the city, where they built one common cistern out of so much concrete that the weight of the town actually became too heavy to support the softness of the landscape, and the town became unstable. The whole town became destabilized, and everybody was required to leave in the 1980s. It must have been the same earthquake that shook Matera so much, now that I think about it. But we were traveling from there, and from this peak, you can see, it's almost like being It's the closest I've come in Italy to being in a place like Wyoming, where you can see way, way for kilometers, you can see on a clear day to the Bay of Taranto. And it struck me in a flash, as Gary remarked, that all of this had been underwater. And this was all the sea floor that we were now standing upon, however millions of years. I'm not a geologist, and my apologies to Gary for botching the details, but the point was that there was the weight that had compressed so much of this earth and sediment, and in fact you could see fossils in Krakow of shells in the walls of these buildings. Fascinating. So while Matera may not actually be a timeless place, it is a place, and its surrounding environments, it is a place that challenges and I think blows open what we mean by time and human habitation, or habitation of any kind, if you are standing on the top of a mountain that used to be under the sea. It's a very powerful experience.
A funny little story. It is this really an aside, but I've been working in South America and Central America with biologists photographing insects. I mean, it's a crazy thing to do, but I love the biologists and I love being in the forest. And I was on a mountaintop at the very boundary between Panama and Colombia. And we'd gone up there 4 or 5 times by this point, and I'm with the same biologist that I'd made all the other trips with. And that day, I noticed a palm tree that I'd never seen. And so I, very agitated, took some pictures, and we couldn't wait to get back. And said, Don, did you see that palm tree? This is a palm. Why have we never seen this tree? It's so beautiful. And he said, oh yeah, I saw it. You want to see my pictures? And we compared pictures and we talked about the tree. And I said, but do you know what it is? No. We get back to the city, Panama City, and we look it up in the big heavy book of all the palms in Central and South America. And there it is, sure enough. And a very elaborate drawing that defined the range of this palm. It was at high altitude, about 3,000 feet at altitude, and it went from the tip of Colombia, which was once Panama had been Colombia, the tip of Colombia, all the way to southern Bolivia. We're saying, I said, Don, can you explain that? That's incredible. Well, how did that tree get from southern Bolivia all the way to Colombia and then just stop? And he said, oh, that's simple, because the isthmus was underwater when that tree was established. And talk about giving your system a shock, and you're thinking, I'm not ready to think about time scales like this. And yet, once you've done it, welcome to the real world.
I'm actually curious, Lindsay, you were asking Emmett about his vision of this Matera. Have you come across many photographs of the other Matera, the modern Matera, the post-war Matera?
There are photographs of the post-Second World War Matera, and also of the post-First World War Matera, because there are lots of interventions and massive interventions actually to support the whole road system during the 1920s and 30s. Because it's in, I think, 1926 or 27, which is under the fascist government, that Matera becomes a provincial capital. And so there's a lot of investment. And the functionaries from the government sent from points north in Italy, Rome, live on and invest in the plateau, not on the Sassi. And there's lots of photographs taken at that occasion. They're not of the
Martella. I mean,
yes.
Those are not art photographs.
Well, La Martella is, of course, there are some photographs of La Martella is the new town, the new neighborhood, sort of suburb that's built, that is open to residents in 1954, along with a series of other spine bianche, which follows shortly thereafter. These are the new developments to which the residents of the Sassi are relocated starting in the mid-1950s and through the 60s and 70s, leading to the kind of abandonment that then Augusto Vigiano, the photographer to whom Emmett is referring, who is actually by trade a librarian and works in Matera as a librarian, who is a self-taught photographer and takes hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs of Matera in that abandoned moment and makes that photography book, in part to spark interest among government entities like the World Monuments Fund or the Historic Preservation Sites, the what is that? That's escaping my World Heritage Fund. Yes, which Matera becomes this UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1994, I believe it is, and it's on the heels of Augusto Villano's publication. So these are ways in which, and this is something I try to emphasize in this exhibition, photography plays an active role in conservation and preservation efforts.
When is Villano's book?
1980.
Okay, Cresci is before Villano. I mean, Cresci's Matera book is the book that actually activated. Now, the Matera book, in which he really surveyed everything it could possibly photograph, and it's a really thick book. That is 75, and that is the beginning of putting Matera on, giving attention to Matera as World Heritage Site, and not only as the archaic, primitive, but rather as a place that ought to be looked at in a whole new way. The 75 book by Mario Cresci, and he was living there because married a local woman from Matera. It was very important, I think, also when you talk to the locals, and I think Villano comes out of that experience with Cresci.
Is he still alive?
He is. Not necessarily doing all that well, but yes. Yeah. So I think at this point, we will invite everybody to continue the conversation together, perhaps over a cocktail, I think. I'm not totally sure about that, but nonetheless, no. Just outside in the lobby, in the exhibition together. I'm sorry, I just flew in with tap water, the good old L'acqua del Sindaco.
Fabulous New York tap water.
Yes. Anyway, I want to say, if I may have just one more second, to say thank you so much to Emmett, to Antonella, and to Emma for all of your wonderful contributions, to everybody else for coming tonight, and to Giorgio and to Mark for hosting us this evening.
Really fantastic to hear this conversation. This is the third setting that we've seen this exhibition in, and there's such density here. And your comments, all of your comments tonight, really made the experience of the exhibition all the more rich. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for your words. So thank you again to Giorgio van Straten. And I'd also like to tell you that we have, for our next conversation, Ayad Akhtar will do a presentation. You might remember his play Junk, which was at Lincoln Center a few seasons ago. And the themes that it raises are still very much with us. So we hope to see you there. You'll get announcements about location and time soon. So thank you again, and thank you, Giorgio.